Hello friends. First of all, I would like to thank you for your patience. I know you have been waiting for this since part 1 dropped, so I hope you're prepared because Adam's revenge is very satisfying. Alright, without further ado, here's part 2. We agreed to a quick meet at a downtown coffee shop. I left the work undone, cleaned up and went through. He was waiting and recognizing me waved me over. He was nothing like what I'd expected based on TV shows and films. He was a small nondescript man. He couldn't have been more than 5'7" or 8. Thin, gray and balding. He wasn't very dark and nor was he one of those almost fair-skinned black men. He was wearing a pair of dark slacks, shirt and an old sports jacket. Even his shoes looked like they came from Walmart. All in all, he was a nobody. I bet he drove a Toyota. Yet his top-of-the-range cell phone belied his outward image, and I smiled inwardly. The man clearly cultivated this image of a nondescript nobody. We shook hands and his strong grip again confirmed my impression of who he was as opposed to the persona he presented. He got to it with little preamble. Let's not beat around the bush, Mr. Carter. We have not caught your wife going to a hotel, going to any clandestine meetings or having sex. He put up his hand to stop me from interjecting. But we have had enough corroborated testimony that she's been having an affair with her boss Anthony Miller for at least 2 years. It seems that it's an open secret at the office. Certainly his daughter Evelyn both knows and not only condones it, but has gone out of her way to facilitate it. They used to meet regularly during the week, and it seems that when you're away she often let the children stay over with friends while she moved into his house for the weekend. He was brutal and unrelenting, trying to get it all out before I exploded, or imploded or whatever it was that I was about to do. His voice started losing volume as my pulse raced and drummed in my ears. My hands were clutching the table like I was having a heart attack. It's one thing to think your wife is ducking another man and something else to have a near stranger confirm it. I wanted to break something. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to go find Jean and slap her stupid face till my hand hurt, but I couldn't do that, could I? Because regardless of how much a woman ripped your guts out or even slapped or punched you, society frowned upon physical retaliation. Clarence was still talking, but I hadn't heard much. I was still burning inside and trying hard to bring myself under control. Furthermore, Mr. Miller has been diagnosed with a very aggressive pancreatic cancer and only has a few months left to live. While I tried to process. What was that? I said that Miller has been diagnosed with metastases of his pancreatic cancer. He is currently undergoing therapy for the 2nd time, but it doesn't look like it's working. It confirmed what Chad had said and what I had discovered, but I hadn't known that it was both terminal and imminent. I finally understood Jean's behavior. Her state of mind. Everything screamed that she was in pain because she was lamenting the man she loved. She was trying to come to terms with his impending demise. I told Clarence of Jean's behavior and how I thought it all tied together, not because he was my friend. Not because he was my confidant, but because he was here in front of me, and I simply needed to talk to someone. My original impression of Clarence's hidden depths were borne out with his next words. Many cheaters try to minimize their actions by saying it was only sex. Or it didn't mean anything, but that's nonsense, Mr. Carter. He took a sip of his almost cold coffee and grimaced. Then looked back up at me. Cheaters don't just have sex. They're invested in each other and the relationship. He frowned as if dredging words from memory. Women need to feel love to have sex. No one has a long-term relationship because of sex. It may start that way, but within a short while there's feelings involved. Love, and it's usually justified by the claim that one can love more than one person. He looked up, judging the effect his words were having on me. Cheaters don't spend all their time having sex, Mr. Carter. They go to restaurants and movies. They go on walks and share moments. They discuss movies, books, politics and ideas. They develop a private language just like spouses do. They share their hopes and dreams and invariably lament the fact that their illicit relationship isn't their full-time relationship. He nodded his head as if agreeing with himself. Typically, they find fault with their spouse to appease their behavior and justify their cheating, and then discuss their spouse's actual, perceived or attributed shortcomings with their other, in an effort to justify their immoral activity. I was shocked and devastated. I mean, I understood all that, but it would have honestly been less painful to think that they were meeting to have sex. My wife was in a relationship with another man who gave her everything I did, but without the burdens of raising kids, making ends meet, household chores and all the rest. She gave him her best and undivided attention. He gave her good times without the everyday drag that imbues a normal marriage. So, nothing to turn their time into the less exciting, more mundane life husbands and wives predominantly share. We spoke generally for a short while longer, then agreed to halt the investigation at this time, while I thought about my next steps. He left while I sat and thought about what my life looked like now. One thing was for sure. My marriage was over. The bullshit thinking of staying together for the kids' sake was not about to fly with me. As much as the idea of being separated from my children was anathema, the reality was that 60% of kids in the US lived in separated or divorced households in any case. I guess mine would not be any different. I sipped on my rapidly cooling coffee. The pain that was permeating every fiber of my being was real, and at the very least there would be pain unleashed on Jean and Miller. I tried to dampen my emotions. This angry, hurt, pained and somewhat irrational thinking wouldn't help me. I thought back to my time in the Far East where I had met many an old-style CEO. They tended to view business and even life in multi-generational terms. They also behaved similarly to Southern Europeans, that when two families went to war there would be, no let up until one was completely destroyed. Easier said than done. I wasn't the head of some triad, or a godfather in the mafia. I was simply an average man living a fairly average life. I had no superpowers, and nor did I have some all-powerful ally that owed me a huge favor. The only thing that's certain is that I was in this alone. I called for more coffee and brooded, scratching my head wondering how I was going to exact my revenge on a dying man. As far as Jean was concerned, it was a simple case of taking away the things she loved and held dear. In other words, everything that she valued in life. Easier said than done, but already there was a plan forming in the back of my head. But first things first. My real and immediate problem was Miller. I knew that he hadn't made me any promises of fidelity. He wasn't married to me, Jean was. But still, he knew she was married, and he went after her anyway, thus disrespecting me, my marriage and my children. There had to be a reckoning. My anger fueled by pain was starting to flare again. All my early psych evaluations at work had to find, amongst others, two traits that needed to be watched and managed. Firstly, I was a risk taker, which was definitely a two-edged sword, and one to watch in a company that was characterized by its conservative approach to trading. And secondly, I was obstinate to the point of becoming intransigent once I chose a position, and these were the two traits that drove me now. I would get revenge regardless of the fallout, and I wouldn't back off till one side was crushed. Even if that side was me. There was an embryo of a plan forming in my head. I called Clarence and, without going into details, asked him to find as many of the troubled women that the Millers had helped through their program. It wasn't quite a fully formed plan. Mostly it was another fishing expedition, but I was fishing for a big fish. In 2014 I had been transferred to our Kenya branch for 3 weeks, and on a free weekend, had joined the local team for some deepwater sport fishing on the Indian Ocean. There I learned some valuable lessons. You don't go out fishing for marlin. First you troll using flashy spoons for bonito, the local name for a small tuna variety known as false albacore in the US, and kawakawa in Hawaii. You reel the lively muscular fish in live, then push the trace through it, and lay the marlin hooks down the length of its body and troll for marlin, using that as live bait. On that trip I was both successful and also saddened when I saw the fight the marlin put up for its life, and swore that would be my one and only foray into big game fishing. But the lesson in catching the marlin was giving me a plan. I drove home while doing breathing exercises until I was centered and able to pretend to be in the same mood I had been earlier after the previous night's lovemaking with Jean. She still wasn't home, so I got busy on the chores I'd left undone. She returned later with Dean and Katie, and we fired up the grill and had steaks and corn on the cob with coleslaw and warm baguettes. I spent the afternoon as an involved father and a dutiful and loving husband. I touched and kissed and did everything just right. I was two people living in the same body. The one was this outward warm loving man, and on the inside was a cynical bastard, and I suddenly realized how easy it was for sex predators to get into a woman's pants. All you have to do is look like you care and sprout some inane bullshit with just the right amount of a romantic overlay, while looking deep in their eyes, and there it was. Certainly Jean was lapping it up. I considered that this must be how psychopaths and sociopaths felt. Cynic Adam thought that with her lover dying and concerned that I might put two and two together, she was in damage control. I was clearly her fallback plan. My time with Dean and Katie though was real as much my time with Jean was like a B-grade movie, yet she was genuinely buying it. Cynic Adam said to remember this after the divorce when I'd be looking to pick up women to get laid. The next few days merged into a weird existence wherein I was both living the lie and watching myself act out the role I had chosen. I wondered if film and TV actors had a similar experience watching themselves on the screen playing a character. On a positive note, George and I had sorted out the new trading entity, registered it in Singapore, and transferred the entire SIA stock portfolio over. That wasn't the only good news. After the roller coaster entry into the market, SIA was trading at $16.33 and climbing. We had already more than doubled our investment and were heading to what I hoped was a 3 times return. Considering how easily I had slipped into my psychopathic persona was making me paranoid, so I added some significant security that required both fingerprint and a password, as well as encrypting all my files and emails. I always switched my laptop off and fully deleted any email that didn't come from George without opening it. I then also downloaded what I wanted on my cell phone to the cloud and reformatted my phone completely, erasing everything and then reloading what I wanted. After that, there wasn't much to do other than investigating other interesting share listings and calling potential investors I knew from JP Morgan as a precursor to making a pitch for some of their business. The one thing I didn't worry too much about was the non-compete clause, as getting fired rendered it mostly null and void. My marriage warfront had gone quiet while I waited for ammunition to arrive, which it did on Thursday, in the form of a thumb drive from Clarence. The handover was at a different coffee shop from last time because my paranoia was running high, although with little or no reason. He had compiled a list of 14 women. They were all he could find. There were short bios, and some even had old photos included. 5 still lived locally. One was a full-time escort. A prostitute really, so clearly Miller's intervention hadn't helped her much. There was a number for her. I went out and bought a burner phone, then called her, and we agreed to meet in a motel on the outskirts of the city. She said it was $100 for an hour, and I would have to pay for the room. She arrived on time at 2 in the afternoon. She was small and thin and covered in tattoos. Her name was Layla and she stood in the doorway. "Show me the money," were her first words. I pulled $200 from my pocket and placed the notes on the bed and waved her over in a come sit gesture. She did. "200 will get you a blue job and a duck, but no coming in my mouth when you duck me. You must wear a condom." She rummaged in her bag and pulled one out. I held up my hand to stop her. "How would you like to make 1,000? I asked, but she jumped up, grabbing her bag. "I don't do no sick sheet, mister." "No sick sheet," I assured her. "I'll pay for information." "What kind?" "I want to know about the home for abused and vulnerable women you were in for a while a few years back." She wasn't sure, but after some back and forth she relented and recounted her story. The short version was that she'd left home as soon as she finished school because she hated her stepdad and found herself on the streets. Eventually, once she lost all hope, she started selling herself for food and a place to sleep. She quickly ended up on drugs and then found herself working the street turning tricks. One particular John had turned nasty when she wouldn't do what he wanted and beat her senseless in his car. Then pushed her out into the street like human garbage. She was found by passers-by who called the cops. They took her to hospital, and someone contacted Mrs. Miller, who offered her a place at the home once she was discharged. She said she was there for almost 6 months until the rules and regulations got to her and she left. She ended her story and we looked at each other silently for a while. Her story was a typical one, although no less tragic. I wondered if what I was about to do would make me another abuser, but my need for revenge overrode all else. "So, when you lived in the house, were you abused immediately, or did it start later?" She blinked rapidly, trying to come to terms with my question. She started to shake her head, no side to side, then froze. I could see the gears turning in her head. "How much?" "I'm thinking 5,000. I started a negotiation." "Why?" I thought about it for a few minutes. She may have been an uneducated prostitute, but her negotiation skills were good enough for any corporate boardroom. "Miller's ruined my marriage and I want to ruin him." I looked at her for any signs of wavering. Would she go for the money or for the greater good? 20,000. She gave me a grim smile while watching me like a hawk to judge my reaction. I thought about it and considered how believable she would be. She was grinning at me. "What?" "I can see you wondering if spending 20,000 on a low-worth individual will help your cause." Sheep. This young tattooed woman was on the ball. She leaned in until we were nose to nose. "Make it 25 and I'll show you the power of the Me Too movement in action." "We'd have to plan this," I told her, "and we'd agree how the money would be transferred." She told me she wanted the money so she could go start afresh somewhere else, as she had a small girl to worry about and had to get out of the business. I made her an honest offer that if this worked out I'd organize her a job in Chicago, and her eyes lit up. "For real?" "For real. You shitting me just to get what you want?" She looked simultaneously hopeful and terrified, like a child that can almost reach candy, but knows that it can be taken away at any time. I managed to convince her that it was on the up and up. We agreed that she'd do what she promised, and we'd meet to discuss next steps as soon as she was ready. We shared numbers. I gave her my burner phone number and asked her to save it under Jerry. "So you want a quick blue job? You paid for it and there's still some time left." I begged off and phase 1 was complete. At home I continued my internal-external dichotomy, and Jean seemed to continue buying it. To be honest, she was too focused on Miller's legacy project to notice much else. I insinuated myself as far as I could without making her suspect anything and got the intel as to how far the project was. We cooked and ate together like in the old days. I ducked her as often as I could. Maybe she thought we were making love, but I viewed her as a better looking whore than Layla. Better fuller body and no tattoos. So I ducked her. I ducked her hard and I ducked her when I wanted and how I wanted. I didn't go down on her ever again, and in that week I ducked her peach on 2 occasions, not once asking for permission. Oh, and every second morning I pushed my clock into her mouth and made her suck me till I came in her mouth with no reciprocity. Why should I worry? She owed me plenty, and the divorce would invariably cost me a pretty penny, so I was getting my money's worth in advance. Yet strangely, instead of getting upset or getting turned off by my behavior, she seemed to thrive on it, and on Friday she woke up, rolled over and gave me a morning blue job without any encouragement or demands from me. She was either loving this new I take what I want persona I was exhibiting, or she was used to getting far more sex between Miller and I, or she was trying to anchor her position as my wife, in light of the impending loss of her lover. Hell, it was at least the later two or maybe even all three. After my blue job, while having breakfast, she said she would be busy helping set up the New Horizons home, and there would be a grand unveiling on Monday at 10. I already knew that. It was all over the company's website and social media pages. I acted interested and interrogated her without seeming to do so. Turned out that they had planned for the mayor and his entourage to cut the tape. There was also a whole lot of local media as well as CBS going to be present. Have they stopped the chemo and radiation so Tony can feel well enough to attend? I overheard her asking. Probably to Evelyn. I couldn't hear the response. It will be a life-defining moment. She gave a small sob. Not if I had anything to do with it. Time to turn up the heat. My divorce papers were ready. All that awaited was my go-ahead to be served. Illinois had become a no-fault state in 2016, and there were also no laws enabling me to sue Miller for loss of affection, so irreconcilable difference as it was. I started the day on SGX. Our shares had reached their issuing price and climbing, albeit in small increments. Good news to start Friday. I grabbed coffee and tuned into WMAY radio station. There was an interview with Evelyn at 9:30. She was talking about the wonderful social responsibility program that MRE and her father Anthony Miller had embarked upon. It was heartwarming stuff, like chicken soup for the soul. She explained how the New Horizons home was simply a permanent development of a program her mom started, and then her dad continued after her mom's death. Now there was the opportunity to turn it into a full-time and fully funded project, but that it would obviously do better with involvement and donations from the community. The host was almost gushing as they discussed its value, and then went to the lines for listener input. WMAY listeners were sounding positive, and a number pledged to make donations. The host promised to post details for donations on WMAY's homepage, and Evelyn said there were details on the MRE website and on New Horizons website. More calls followed in a similar vein until... Hello? The voice on the other side was hesitant. She was urged to speak up, and between her voice breaking and some soft sobs, she managed to raise her voice. Please don't believe that the home helped anybody. She managed to cry out. All it did was let Mr. Miller have his way with the women. She broke down sobbing on the phone. Evelyn went into an apoplectic fit. Never. That never happened. My father is a good man. He'd never do anything like that. The caller was still on the line. He did, not just once. Her voice rose with justified indignation and anger. Do you know what I am now? She shouted out in a broken voice. I'm a whore. I work on the street. That's all I'm worth thanks to your precious father. Her pain was palpable. My name is Layla and your father ruined me. She sobbed and the line went dead. The station went on an advertising break. When they came back, the host was torn between his original interview and addressing the elephant crowding the airwaves. Evelyn was stunned at the turn of events and was trying to explain that it was nonsense, and her father was a good man who would never do something like that. It was obvious that she believed it, but then again we all want to believe the best about our parents. The lines had all lit up with callers both castigating and praising Layla. One said, what can you expect from a whore? She's obviously trying to make money out of it. Some wanted to ask questions of Evelyn, and some suggested that the authorities, whomever they may be, get involved. The talk show host was no fool. This had turned from a small low-interest story into an emotional maelstrom, with listeners adding their own take on what was real and what wasn't. The furor was at its height when a well-modulated voice came on the air. My name is Rita. I don't want to give my surname out on the air. She sounded shaky but determined. But I have left it with your producer so I can be contacted. She took a shuddering breath. Anthony Miller sexually assaulted me too. And the lines went wild. Over on WTAX, a listener called in to discuss what was happening on WMAY. Next minute the lines got busy with pros and cons on each side. A while later a woman called in. She spoke in a small frightened voice. I'm a married woman with children. She cried. I had hoped to put this behind me, but I was also molested by Mr. Miller. She broke and sobbed on air. I'm sorry, I promise. I promised I wouldn't say anything. But I can't live with it. I was young and needed help, and he made me do things to him. I couldn't say no. I didn't know how. She switched off. There was a long silence before the host was able to say anything. It sounded like he was crying. I called Vicky, an old school friend working for the local paper and doing the news for 2 of the regional radio stations. I asked if she had heard what was going on at WMAY and WTAX. She had. I told her I was worried because my wife worked for MRE and on the New Horizons home project. I asked her for her opinion. She wasn't sure, but she would be chasing this down. She said if it was true it would be the biggest abuse case to hit Springfield in 2 generations. By lunchtime the story went quiet on the airwaves. None of the radio presenters wanted to stick their necks out with an opinion. Social media and Twitter in particular, however, went wild. Initially it was a 50-50 split for and against, but within a few hours, it had turned into a rabid witch hunt, and woe befall anybody who sided with Miller. Hundreds then thousands of women got onto platforms to tell their stories of abuse from various sources. Some were detailed, others were little more than a Me Too acknowledgement. Some were so graphic that they were X-rated. Within hours it was impossible to discern the truth from the bullshit. It had gone viral and was crossing not only states but whole continents. I switched off with a giant pounding headache. I reached for the Tylenol. The afternoon was early and the children were still at school. The stress and emotion of the day had left me sweaty and feeling grubby. I stripped off my clothes in the laundry, padded naked to the shower, and collapsed under the jet of warm water. I sat down and cried like I hadn't cried since my mom died. In fact, I cried harder. Losing my mom was a stab to the heart, but this was a knife to my soul. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The saying by Nietzsche that he who fights monsters should be careful lest he thereby becomes a monster himself described me precisely. Miller had done me wrong, but I had unleashed a firestorm that I had already lost control of. All I can do now is hold on and pray. I picked up Dean and Katie and went home to prepare a chicken stir-fry with noodles and a small oriental salad on the side. We waited for Jean but nothing. I tried calling her, but her phone was off. Eventually we ate and I put a plate of food away for Jean in the microwave and a small bowl of salad in the fridge. Dean, Katie, and I sat down to play a board game called Forbidden Island, and still no Jean. By 10, the kids were in their bedrooms and I was alone in the living room when she arrived. She looked like she had just gone through the ringer. Her eyeshadow had run. Her hair was a mess, and she had the aura of a woman whose world had just come crashing down. Have you heard? She took a shuddering breath. Have you heard all the vile things they're saying about Tony? She groaned, collapsing on a chair. I handed her a large cognac which she gratefully accepted, downing half in a single swig. I have. Seems like your boss is a sexual predator. I told her in a flat, unemotional voice. Where there's smoke there's invariably fire. No, Adam. He's a good man. He'd never do something like that. Time to start phase 2. Jean. She looked up from her cognac. You obviously didn't know the man very well. It's not like you know me. I turned the screws. You and I have no secrets. We're man and wife, so you know what I'm capable of just as much as I know you. I held her eyes. You might know Miller as your boss, but who knows what he's really like. I watched conflicting thoughts and emotions play across her face. No, he's a good man. He'd never do anything like that. I'd know. I gave her my helplessly confused look. But how, Jean? How would you know? It's your boss, a work colleague. He could be harboring a million secrets. I haven't interacted with him much, but I've always found an underhand look to him. He's the kind of man you don't leave alone with your wife or your daughters. She gasped. Has he ever tried anything with you? She went white and I pretended not to notice. No, never. How can you even ask that? She tried to glower at me but ended up looking mostly dismayed. Because you're a good-looking woman, Jean, and if what they say about him is true, then he must be quite immoral. She broke into tears and looked deeply into her cognac glass, but there were no answers to be found there either. She finished it and headed wearily upstairs. She said hello and good night to Dean and Katie, and then I heard the shower start. I finished my cognac and headed to bed. By the time she came out of the shower I pretended to be half asleep. She went downstairs in a dressing gown. I climbed out of bed and walked to the landing. She was talking to someone. Probably Evelyn by the sound of it. She repeatedly said nightmare. Then she asked, but why? Why would more than one woman say she was assaulted? Finally she said that she didn't think this would blow over easily. How right she was. She made a second call. Hi Tony, I heard her say. I caught snippets as she proceeded to tell him it would all be resolved, and it was all some kind of big misunderstanding. I struggled to hear as she had moved into the kitchen, but I caught her last words. I love you too. I heard the microwave ping and she spent some time by herself, probably eating. By the time she came to bed I was already asleep. On Saturday, I woke up first and made breakfast, then took Dean and Katie to sport practice. I returned home while on the phone to Vicky. She said that another woman had come forward making it 4 so far. She also informed me that her sources in the mayor's office said that the whole project was now considered toxic and were distancing themselves from it. This was soon followed by a number of civic associations cutting loose. By mid-morning the Office of the Attorney General issued a statement that they would be investigating this case fully. When I got home she was gone. The STX was closed so there wasn't much to do. I spoke to George about business and my dad about the state of my marriage. He agreed that it was irrevocably broken. He said he felt sorry for Dean and Katie, but like the rest of the kids in the US, they would learn to cope. I called Jean. Where are you? Evelyn and I are with the company lawyers to try to fight these vile claims. Are you sure you should be involved in this? I colored my voice with concern. The spillover could be significant, and you don't want to be caught in it. She fought me on it just like I knew she would, but all their lawyering helped nothing. On Saturday afternoon and Sunday, which was their busiest open house show days, MRE had less than 20% of their previous foot traffic. By Monday morning the phones were ringing off the wall with cancellations and withdrawals of sales mandates. They placed the opening of the New Horizons home on ice, until all the negative publicity came to an end. That Monday, another woman came forward in an unusual way. This one was married to a wealthy business owner and well known in the community. She actually took out a quarter-page advert in the local paper and said that she had been sexually assaulted by Miller during her short stay at the home for troubled teenagers. Turns out that she had developed a drug problem together with her boyfriend. He was fired from work, then she was fired, and within a short while they were living beneath a freeway bridge. He got into trouble with some drug dealers and disappeared, leaving her alone. Eventually she was found begging for food at the back door of a fast food franchise, and the manager called the cops. One of the cops knew of the home and took her there. She said she had spent 8 days in total in the home before she gave them her name, and they contacted her parents. During that time the man she knew as Mr. Miller sexually assaulted her twice by forcing her to perform fellatio on him on both occasions. She left her lawyer's details for all women who were assaulted by Miller to contact the lawyer, so they could start a class action. By the end of that week 5 things had happened. Firstly, Miller had been questioned by the DA in hospital, and had subsequently taken a turn for the worse. Secondly, 3 of the 5 women had come through and spoken to the police, giving statements. All claimed to have been sexually assaulted. Interestingly, all the assaults had occurred during a short time period of about 5 years ago. Thirdly, the media storm had intensified to the point where MRE had closed its doors until further notice. Jean naively confided in me every night about how hard Evelyn was trying to keep the business going, while salespeople were bailing and taking customers with them. Fourth was that Sia had breached the $24 mark, and I was slowly dribbling blocks of shares onto the market, which were getting rapidly picked up without dropping the share price. We had made back our original investment, and we still held 2/3 of the shares. To put it bluntly, we were sitting pretty. My dad had collected Dean and Katie for the weekend. I was coming back from a small boutique liquor store, where I had purchased a chilled bottle of 2012 vintage Veuve Clicquot. I was ready to celebrate number 5 with Jean. I noticed a BMW X5 SUV with MRE branding on the doors parked in my driveway next to Jean's Lexus. I pulled up and walked in with a jaunty air. They were in the living room. Jean was crying and Evelyn was rubbing her back and generally comforting her. Ladies. I gave them a small salute as I walked over the cabinet where we kept our crystal and hooked out 3 champagne flutes. They looked at me dumbstruck with their mouths hanging open as I tore off the foil, twisted the wire to remove the cage, and popped the cork with a flourish. Then liberally filled the 3 flutes and handed them 1 each. They were both in some sort of numb state, like their brains were on tilt that they accepted the proffered glasses. Sell it. I toasted, down half of mine and burped. Then the shouting started. Jean, you're divorcing me. I thought we were family. I spotted the open envelope with the divorce papers lying on the coffee table. Evelyn, how could you, Adam? Don't you care for your wife? Don't you love her? Drink up, Jean. We're celebrating the end of an era. I downed the rest of my champagne and reached for the bottle. Hello, Evelyn. Firstly, I could and I did. Secondly, I stopped caring and stopped loving her when she became your father's whore. I topped my glass and saluted Evelyn. Here's to your father's legacy, Evelyn. I hope he lives long enough to go to trial, so the whole world can discover what a piece of sheep he really is. She went white and collapsed backwards. Drink up. I laughed at her. And let's also drink to the demise of MRE. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I downed my glass and threw it across the room to shatter against the far wall. Jean wailed, but Evelyn pulled her legs back as if to jump up or launch herself at me. I crossed the space between us in an instant and put the tip of my index finger against her forehead and pushed her back. You come at me, Evelyn, and I'll slap you down without remorse like the rabbit witch you are. Her eyes went wide with fear, and she collapsed inwards on herself. Consider yourself lucky that I've decided not to take revenge on you personally. I turned to Jean. Get yourself a lawyer, whore. I smirked at her. The kids stay with my father till custody is established. Her eyes were wide with fear. This was a side of me she'd never seen before. I suppose I had turned into the very monster I'd feared that I'd become. But, I thought we were good. She managed to splutter and I laughed out loud. You mean all the ducking? I sure hope you didn't mistake it for making love. I ducked you like I would a whore, Jean. I paid for your count, and I was just getting some of what you owe me. I grabbed a new flute and poured myself more champagne and waved the bottle at the girls. Evelyn had dropped her flute on the rug making a mess. Jean had snapped the delicate stem on her flute and was sucking her bleeding finger. They looked at me the way one would consider a madman with his finger on a trigger. So, I'll take that as a no to more champagne then. You left me alone for so long, and so often. I needed some human contact. She tried to justify herself, but she couldn't quite meet my eyes. I understand. I smiled coldly. Your count needed contact with his clock. I laughed without humor. How's that working out for you now? But it was Evelyn that came back at me. And how many women did you screw while you were away from home? You men all want your women to be angels when you're away while you do whatever you want. Don't mistake all men for behaving like the piece of sheep that fathered you. Just because he was happy to duck everything he could, ruining young women in marriages, doesn't mean the rest of us sank to his depravity. I glared at her hoping she would try argue or even come at me, as I was itching to flat-hand her like the witch she was. But I could read her eyes, and she knew that I would slap her face off her shoulders if she tried. She was a self-entitled count, but she understood that once she initiated combat, her gender would offer her no immunity from the pain that would follow. I leaned into her face, daring her to strike me so I could retaliate. Your father is a molester, a sex offender, a predator of vulnerable women, a disgusting pig. He will probably die before he goes to prison, but you, my whore wife, and the world will know him for what he is. His legacy project will never take off, and his money will be frozen by the courts against future claims by his victims. MRE will file for bankruptcy and will cease to exist, and you will have to travel far away and change your name to escape the stench of your actions and your father's depravity. She was shaking and crying at my verbal assault. I bet she wished she was a man so she could punch me. I also wished she was a man so I could let out the rage I had so carefully kept damped for these past weeks, and break some bones. In fact, it seems to me, Evelyn, that you probably helped groom those girls just like Ghislaine Maxwell did for Jeffrey Epstein. Her mouth worked without words at the horror I was unleashing. I think I need to contact the news media to let them know about you. She was shaking her head from side to side, her eyes wide in fear and dismay. No. Please, I didn't. It's all a lie. Some sort of mistake. I don't know what those women are getting out of it, but it's not true. My father is a good man. I turned to Jean. You have 2 hours to grab your clothes and move out. When I come back, if you're still here, I'll call the press and give a statement. In fact, I'll invite them to interview you for your part in this horrendous crime. Duck you. She spat at me. There's nothing for me to be sorry for. Well, except for the cheating and the lies. I'll move out, but I'll get a lawyer first thing, and then we'll see who gets what. Oh my, Jean had found a set of balls. 2 hours. I promised her. I left and went to my car, but only got a few blocks down the road when all the unused adrenaline in my body caught up with me, and I hyperventilated and went into the shakes. It lasted about 15 minutes before I got my body under control and could move on. I drove around aimlessly for a while. Eventually I pulled myself together and phoned my dad. I told him about serving papers on Jean, and reiterated that he was to hang on to the Dean and Katie until further notice. Also, although he should allow Jean to visit them at no time, must she be left alone with them to poison them against me. We spoke and I drove until the car pinged that I was on reserve. I located a petrol station, filled up and headed back home, surprised how far from home I was, and it was after 10 by the time I got back. The house felt like a mausoleum, filled with ghosts of happier times. The silence was loud in my ears and I couldn't sleep. 2,500 years ago, Socrates said that the unexamined life was not worth living, and I lay in bed doing my best not to examine myself or look too deeply into my psyche, over the furor I had unleashed in order to extract revenge. The only thing I knew for sure is that it had gone too far to be stopped. My fear was that what happened on social media was one thing, but if it ended in a courtroom it may all unravel or implode. Would I be implicated? It seemed to me that I needed to get Layla out of town, so my direct link to the issue was at least removed. Having resolved that, I managed to fall into a semi-sleep. I awoke the next morning feeling almost as tired as when I climbed into bed. After the morning rituals, I headed downtown for breakfast. I called the kids. They were doing fine, but Dean was already suspecting that things weren't right at home. I promised that I'd talk with him and Katie soon. I contacted Layla on the burner phone while having coffee. So, did I come through as promised? I admitted that she had. We spoke and confirmed that she'd be leaving for Chicago the next day. I had already transferred money from my offshore trading account to one of George's offshore accounts. He then transferred in small amounts to a bank account she had opened, and Layla was $25,000 richer and on her way to a job as an assistant in property management, organized by one of George's investment contacts, who ran a number of commercial properties. I was having a second cup of coffee when Vicky called. 3 of the women have lawyered up and are suing Miller for damages, she informed me. Papers will be served on Monday. We spoke for a while. She said that she and her news editors were surprised at the timing and the way this whole story had unfolded. But she rationalized that it wasn't surprising in the current climate. Once the first woman, Layla, the one who claimed to be a prostitute, went public, the rest followed, very much like the Harvey Weinstein case. I spent the rest of Saturday with Dean and Katie. I told them that their mom and I would be divorcing because she had an affair with her boss Anthony Miller. Katie wasn't entirely sure what an affair was. Dean got it. Was she sleeping with Mr. Miller, Dad? I nodded sadly. Was it sex? Asked Katie. For a 12-year-old, she sure was precocious. Yes, they've been sleeping together for a long time. Katie cried. Dean was stoic. We gathered ourselves and, taking my dad along, we all went to the driving range and smacked a few buckets of balls. Dean and Katie used some of my older cut-down clubs, and both had a good natural swing. We went to a Greek restaurant for supper and eventually called it an early night. I returned to my silent mausoleum and had another sleepless night. Sunday, I fielded phone calls from her parents. They wanted to know if there was any hope for reconciliation. For the kids' sake, they said. How can I reconcile with a woman that's conducted an affair with her boss for years and years? I asked. And the man turns out to be a sexual predator of young women. Gene may even have been involved. There were collective gasps. Living in Arizona had inured them from the bombshell that had hit Illinois. It will all come out in court. I assured them and rang off, hopefully leaving them with their perception of their daughter in ruins. Life went on, mostly slowly and painfully in fits and starts. Dean and Katie were back at home with me, and my dad had moved in to help out. That in essence left me free to pursue business, which was picking up as George and I were getting a lot of glowing referrals. At the end of the second week, the furor over Miller was abating somewhat. Vicky informed me that the 4th woman had joined the class suit against Miller. But not Layla, I thought. That was strange. She was sharp enough, and I thought she was mercenary enough to go after a piece of the pie. Oh well, it was a mystery for another day. I had a meeting between Gene's lawyers and my lawyers about a division of assets. I had opened investment accounts for Dean and Katie's education from what was our combined cash or near cash assets, so that couldn't be touched. My final salary and payouts from JP Morgan had gone directly into my offshore account, and her lawyers were still trying to get paperwork from my previous employer. So although they suspected that there was some sort of golden handshake, they had no idea how much, but it was only a matter of time before they subpoenaed the HR records. My offer was that I would pay her nothing as she had a job and generally made good money. She claimed there should have been at least $250,000 in cash and near cash assets. I assured them that it had been lost on underperforming shares. Both Jean and her lawyer called bullshit on that, but I laughed. Take the deal, Jean, otherwise I'll take the house payment off the table, and we'll fight over that also till you run out of money for lawyers. I will cripple you financially. Why are you such an asshole? She glared at me. I deserve half of everything from our marriage. Go to your other husband and ask him for money, Jean. Seems you had more of a marriage with him than you did with me. Better hurry though, he might not have much left after those poor assaulted women get through with him for what he did to them. I wish I could say that after that it was over, but it wasn't. Not by a long shot. It would drag on and on for months, but I held most of the cards, and I had a righteous anger to sustain me. She vacillated from meeting to meeting. On one she would go on about how I was making the whole thing between her and Miller seem like so much more than it was. At the next one she was blaming me for her behavior. Then she wanted to know why we had to get divorced, and if we couldn't work it out. The next time I'd hear from her was that she was going to take me to the cleaners. At another meeting where I was refusing to budge, her lawyer said he would get her back into the house immediately. I gave her my biggest duck you grin possible. Best you tread carefully around me, Jean, or I'm going to every possible media outlet to expose your complicity in this sex abuse ring. She lost color beyond white and went gray like a heart attack victim. Try me and watch what happens to you next. Leaving her lawyer's offices, I noticed Evelyn sitting in the foyer. She glared at me spitefully. I smiled at her the way one does to a dead woman walking, and her smile wavered and died. You should have stayed out of it, Evelyn. Oh well, you'll reap what you've sowed. 2 days later, Layla was another $5,000 richer, and the local papers, Twitter and the rest of social media, was abuzz with the latest revelations that Evelyn Miller had helped her disgraced sexual predator father Anthony Miller recruit young women. It's called sex trafficking, which the DA's office came under fire for not having arrested Miller, and for not having acted against his daughter. The DA addressed a media briefing saying that they were still in the early stages of the investigation. The media pulled no punches, and another storm erupted with the public still raw over Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. Soon the baying for blood had expanded to include Evelyn Miller. Miller was sued by the 4 women that had gone public. I became seriously concerned and started having sleepless nights. Taking it to court was a huge risk for me, and could easily derail the whole thing. Week 6 since I returned from Singapore. I was working from home as usual when my doorbell rang. It was Evelyn. What do you want? I wasn't about to play nice. Can we talk, Adam? No. I don't want to be associated with a sexual predator like you. I glared at her and closed my door, leaving her standing outside. She rang again, like I knew she would. Please, Adam. Just a talk, she implored. I wanted to laugh out loud. Where's your entitlement now, witch? Instead I said, I don't think so. You just want to record me and try to get me to say something you can spin for your own purposes. I won't, I promise. She looked like she was ready to get on her knees and beg. Okay. Her eyes lit up, but I put my hand out to stop her. But first go put your handbag and your phone in your car. I watched her comply. Wait here. I closed the door and unobtrusively set up my burner phone, where it could cover the whole living room and hit record. I opened the door and indicated for her to enter. Assume the position I ordered. Damn it, she gasped. What are you doing? I'm making sure. I patted her down, lifted her loose skirt, ran my hands up her thighs, felt her peach over her panties. Before she could protest, I kicked her legs open and ran my hand over her kitty to her mom's. Nothing there either. I spun her round facing me, and I felt the front of her panties, just to make sure. Yup, definitely nothing. I felt up her sides, the front of her bra, then plunged my hands inside her top and lifted her breasts, searching underneath. The only thing I found were 2 very erect nips. I kept my eyes locked on hers as I made sure she wasn't hiding anything, and she wouldn't be tread from her upper chest, up her neck and all over her cheeks. She shook me off angrily. Okay, speak. I released her and moved to the nearest couch. She looked unsure as to whether to stand or sit, but I motioned her to a seat opposite me, and she sat on the edge, as if she needed to bolt at any minute. She brushed some loose hair from her face and composed herself. I thought you were a nice guy, Adam. She searched my face for answers. Yeah, well, nice guys finish last, don't you know? She nodded as if I had confirmed something. I know it's you, Adam. It's you who's created this whole nightmare. I simply looked at her emotionless. She probably thought I was the serpent in her Garden of Eden. Stop this now, Adam. I simply sat and looked at her unspeaking, so she changed tack. I know you're hurt by Jean's affair with my father. Who wouldn't be? But this nonsense about my father sexually abusing women is a lie, and it needs to stop. It must be retracted. I laughed in her face. There's nothing I can do, Evelyn. It's up to the courts now. Please, Adam. Please stop this. I know you can. I smiled mirthlessly. Now that your world has imploded, you want me to help you. Where were you when your father was ducking my wife? Her face went back to red. Oh yes, you were helping things along by making sure she was amenable to becoming your father's whore. We stared at each other wordlessly for a long while. I could read her face as she selected then rejected arguments to sway me. Finally. When are you going to stop, Adam? When will you be satisfied? Her eyes got murky, then tears rolled down her face, and she visibly deflated. This was not an act. She was a woman defeated. Not until your family is completely destroyed, Evelyn. She jerked at that. Her eyes opened in horror. There can be no stopping. There will be no ceasefire. There will be no peace until your family is completely and utterly ruined. I spoke slowly and deliberately. I wanted her to know that this was no game. She couldn't tap out. This was real, and it would only end with the total destruction of the Millers. She recognized the truth of it and was silent as she processed it all. Then she surprised me by coming back for one more try. Do you want revenge, Adam? Do you want to duck me? Make me your whore, like she wrung her hands and looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. She was in her mid-30s, unmarried and no children. Her Facebook pages had indicated that she had recently broken up with her latest partner, so she was single. I considered her. She was fit and trim with good legs and a large bubble butt so in vogue, thanks to Kim Kardashian. Her breasts were firm on the largest size, and she wasn't ugly. Are you suggesting we go to your father's hospital room together with Jean, so I can duck you like a cheap whore in front of the Evelyn? I raised a questioning eyebrow. And afterwards, you can sit on Daddy's face so he can clean out your used count while Jean watches. She went white and stood up, her hands going to her chest defensively. You pig. She screamed at me. You filthy ducking pig. I jumped over and grabbed her arms. Yes, but I'm not a sex predator like your father. I didn't abuse defenseless women at a time when they were at their most vulnerable. Your father did, and he will be ruined, and so will you, and everything he built and you built will turn to ash. She staggered to the door and ran to her BMW on unsteady legs. I watched her drive erratically down the street. I had conflicting emotions of satisfaction that I had given her pain and given her a preview of how much more would follow. Simultaneously, I felt sickened by my ability to be this callous and this uncaringly brutal about another's feelings. It was early, but a drink was called for. Maybe more than one. The remainder of the week saw me in and out of lawyers' offices. In between that, I kept working on picking up more clients. There was a smaller company floated on the Hong Kong SC that looked promising, and a natural gas exploration company drilling in the Indian Ocean off South Africa, and Mozambique's coastline floated on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. George and I were completing our due diligence before we took them to the investor group. The class action suit by the 4 women against Miller was in full swing. The Millers, led by Evelyn and her bevy of lawyers, were trying to mitigate and reach an out-of-court settlement. The DA was indecisive about how to go about prosecuting a man on his deathbed, so we all waited with bated breath. A particularly juicy morsel somehow came out from the private meetings between the accusers and the Millers. Apparently, when Evelyn denied that her dad was a sex offender and that the women were lying, one leaned forward and said, "Would you like me to describe his clock in detail?" He had it in my face often enough. And it was all over, bar the shouting. I heard that the Millers were cleaned out almost to the penny. All the properties owned by the company were sold, and the women walked away with payouts that were over $2 million each. The amount was not disclosed, but it was huge. That was effectively the end of MRE. I needed one more thing to complete my revenge, so I went to the hospital and walked into Miller's room by looking official and walking like I belonged, and no one challenged me. I was there to make sure he knew who had ruined him, his legacy and his entire life. You ducked my wife and I ducked your life, Miller. You will die knowing that your reputation is ruined, your company has collapsed and the world hates you. I looked at him without remorse. Was she worth it? He only lived 2 more days. Evelyn had him cremated. There were only 5 people at the small get-together after. One of them was Jean. She wanted to take Dean and Katie with her. I told her that I'd see her dead first. You would, wouldn't you? She looked at me with a mixture of fear and hatred, very much like Evelyn had on our last encounter. I had no idea you were so vindictive. You ruined him. It was you, wasn't it? She cried. And for what? Because he and I had a relationship. You went crazy and wrecked so many lives. Tears were rolling down her face. I laughed harshly. You sowed the seeds, Jean. You. Why didn't you simply tell me you wanted someone else? I would have hurt, but it would have been honest. We could have divorced and that would have been that. But you chose to disrespect me instead, and that was unacceptable. She became introspective for a moment. I loved Tony. She admitted softly. He gave me something I needed. When he was with me 100%. With you I always felt like your job came first and I came second. She scribbled through her handbag and found a pack of tissues and wiped her eyes. Then, once we had Dean and Katie, I didn't even come second. It was your job, the kids and I got whatever was left. She looked me in the eyes. I needed someone who put me first for a change. I could have walked away and left her with her happy memories, but I didn't. I pulled out my phone. Listen to this. Was she worth it? She heard me say. No. No, Kitty was worth this. He wheezed. You've ruined everything I took a lifetime to build. I laughed harshly. You brought it on yourself, Miller. I ducked you up real good. How? How did you know? What? How did you know about me using them for sexual favors? There was a long silence as I had tried to process it, then I started laughing and I couldn't stop. There was a thud as I dropped the phone. Then I finally got my laughing under control. I didn't. I started laughing again. Oh, the wonder of it all. I didn't know, Miller. I thought I was making it up, but now I understand why those 4 women came after you the way they did. All it took was one small crack and then the dam burst. Duck you, Carter. He wheezed and gasped for breath. Those women owed me. He tried to sit up to show he still had some bravado. I ducked your wife and I ducked her good and she loved it. She loved me for it and I enjoyed taking her away from you. I bet those were the most expensive ducks you could have had, Miller. She cost you everything, and now the world knows you for the sexual predator you are. Jean collapsed to the floor and went catatonic. I walked away. She was no longer my problem. Epilogue. When MRE was shedding assets as fast as they could to free up cash, I purchased the house they were converting into the New Horizons home for a song. It took some doing to bring all the players together, but it all fell into place like it was predestined. Once the deal was signed and sealed, I took out ads in the local papers and went on radio to announce that I had purchased the New Horizons home and would turn it into a fully fledged halfway home for abused women. It would only ever be run by women without men involved in its operations or day-to-day activities. I renamed it the Joy Carter home after my mother. My dad cried and kissed me. Dean and Katie were impressed. The home was placed in a trust. My father and I were trustees together with the 4 women who had sued Miller. They were all more than happy to be involved, and they all added some of their newfound wealth to making the dream a reality. Local and regional media called it a Phoenix project, and heaped praises on me and the women, although I tried to stay out of the limelight as much as possible. Beyond creating a social responsibility initiative, it had the added benefit of making me look good in front of the judge when it came to my divorce. The end result was that Jean got primary custody. I'd be paying maintenance until Dean and Katie turned 18, and Jean got to stay in the house till then, but she would have to contribute 50% to the mortgage, and there was zero alimony for her. In one of the meetings when we were trying to hash who got what, she claimed that I had hidden money. I told her to drop it, or I would turn her life to sheep, and surprisingly she did. She had become very wary of me, and I could see how she chose her words carefully, ensuring that she didn't upset me. I suppose this was what fear looked like. I told her that she'd be getting a significant windfall from the house once it was sold, and that was that. It took some time, but eventually we were divorced. I bought a 3-bedroom condo so that the kids could stay over. I had them almost every weekend as Jean was back to selling houses, and weekends were her busty periods, so I benefited. I did miss them from time to time as I was back to traveling regularly, especially to the Far East. But generally life wasn't that bad. I laughed at myself. It was bad, but not that bad. Jean's relationship with Evelyn unraveled immediately after I played her the recording of my confrontation with Miller. I also distributed an edited version of the voice recording of her father, admitting sexually assaulting those women as far and wide as I could. In fact, it was another thing that developed a life of its own independent of what the original intent was. Evelyn left after a couple of months and I never heard from her, or of her again. I caught up with Layla in Chicago. Her real name was Leanne Roxton. She had cleaned up real good and was reveling in her work. Did you know? I asked her. It was like an open secret, she affirmed. No one admitted to the abuse directly. Everyone was scared that getting kicked out into the street would have been worse. Why didn't you also come forward? I asked, wondering. She laughed and shook her head. I had no idea, she admitted. Well, firstly, I wasn't abused or anything. I contacted some of the women I knew and asked them if they would be prepared to say they were abused, and I'd give them $5,000. She looked at me hard, daring me to gainsay her mercenary actions. But I had no room to talk. The second woman I still had contact with was Rita French. She fell apart on the phone and switched off on me. But when I called the radio station a few days later when Miller's daughter was on air, as you heard, the first one was Rita. She obviously decided that she had held on to it long enough. She sipped on her soda pop. I didn't even have to pay her. I called her after the radio show, and she said that she only vaguely remembered one of the others. But before she could even try to contact her, the Me Too campaign had started organically, and once started, the whole thing just ran away with us. You could have made so much money, I commiserated. She shook her head sadly. By the time they were suing Miller, I was in Chicago, and honestly, I had no idea what was going on. When I looked again, it was all over. She smiled a little wistfully at what could have been. But you gave me a good start, Adam. Thank you. Well, that was it. My revenge was over, and against all odds, my actions had been justified. It was more than I had expected. I kept telling myself I wasn't a monster, but was I? The Millers had been destroyed just like in some fictional saga. I had learned my lessons in revenge and executed them beyond my wildest dreams. Financially, I was starting to do really well, business was growing, and George was starting to talk about me buying him out so he could retire. Dean and Katie had adjusted the way teenagers do. Their focus was on school, friends, and sport. Mom and Dad were already relegated to the role of convenient ATMs and chauffeurs. Life went on as it always does. About 4 years after the divorce, Jean started dating an older man. They lived together for a while. After a couple of years of cohabitation they married. Dean and Katie said he was a nice guy. I was footloose and fancy-free, which is just a fancy way of saying I wasn't dating anyone seriously. I guess I still had issues with trust. After a long while and at my father's insistence, I started seeing a trauma counselor and began the process of feeling better about myself and life in general, but I still have a long way to go. The end. And that's it for our 2-part story, friends. I hope Adam's revenge left you satisfied. If you enjoyed this story, drop a like and comment before you leave. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss any video. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next one.